over in Russia, and then you can use it to cook your dinner in. Well, maybe that's true. But you see, the problem over in Russia is that at that time it was a socialist state, and basically they could get away with making crummy stuff because that's all you had. There was no competition. And instead of spending their money making better Barbie dolls or better microwave ovens, they were spending their money developing scalar weapons. So that's why we had this idea that they were all ignorant peasants. Also, U.S. scientists arrogantly assumed that we knew all the laws of physics, and we don't. It's a big universe out there, folks, and we don't even begin to understand it, and yet we think we do. We are also over-reliant on our huge nuclear arsenal. I mean, we have all of these nuclear weapons. We have the triad base, where you have one leg of the triad is our land-based missiles, one leg of the triad is our bomber wings, B-52 bombers, B-1 bombers in the air, 24 hours a day. And then, of course, we have the best part is our nuclear submarines, which can't be detected, so we think, and they're cruising around in international waters with payloads of dozens of nuclear warheads. And we're so confident in that. We put all of our eggs, so to speak, in the nuclear basket. What if someone came along with a weapon that could totally nullify that arsenal? Because I'll tell you right now, if our information is correct, all you would have to do if you were in Russia is flick a button, aim a certain thing a certain way, and you could wipe out every missile in America, make them all duds in the contiguous 48 states in about 5 seconds. And then where would we be? In our pride, in our technology, we forgot about Sputnik. Remember Sputnik, those of you that are old enough? I'll tell you, I can remember it. I mean, it was the first satellite in orbit, and we didn't do it. The Russians did it. And it was scary. I can remember, in fact, seeing these big, huge headlines I went to Catholic school and nuns were all scared and everything because they kept thinking that, the communists were going to come over and take over America and rape the nuns. And we heard about that almost every day, and especially after this Sputnik thing happened. They were having us pray every day to protect America from the Russians coming over and invading and raping the nuns. And I had nightmares about this. It was so scary. And I didn't even know what rape was. I was only 8 years old. But it sounded scary, And they were thinking that the Soviets could rain down nuclear fire on us from space. And then the other thing we forgot, who put the first man in orbit? The Russians, Yuri Gagarin. We forgot that the Soviets almost won the space race. So again, we were just so cocky and so self-confident we let this slip by, I'm afraid. So, back in the 60s, Robert McNamara was always worried about the missile gap. Who has the most nuclear missiles? Well, now we have a scalar electromagnetic or electrogravitation gap. See, a lot of you people, I'm sure, know about the HAARP, the High Altitude Auroral Research Project. That's something America has, or at least it did. I hear varying reports that it's either was dismantled or it was moved or whatever. But the point is, that was a very high level of technology that we possessed. But unfortunately, it was only first generation. The Russians are working on third or now even fourth generation iterations of this technology. So, we're really playing catch up, folks. Now, what are the types of scalar weapons? Well, first of all, there's exothermic mode, then there's endothermic mode, and there's the mind snapper mode. Now, there's some big words there. Exothermic is just a fancy physics term for something that gives off heat. If you strike a match, that's exothermic. On the other hand, endothermic means any process that absorbs heat. And that mind snapper name is pretty evocative. I don't think we need to define that. We'll talk more about each of these in a second. Now, you'll see there on that graphic, that's a drawing of a Tesla globe. That has been, it's called a 3D scalar interferometry hemispherical shell that has been placed over a city or over a battlefield, doesn't really matter, and nothing can get through that. In the drawing you see jets, you see missiles hitting it and just exploding on impact. And this is called the famous Tesla globe or Tesla shell. And the way this works is if you make one of these, it's about 50 miles in diameter. It has incredible power, and if something hits it, it just basically it's kind of like those bug zappers you have on your your back porch in the summertime and a mosquito hits it and bzzz, you know. Well, if a missile hits this thing, it just instantly disintegrates. It melts in just a blaze of plasma. There's nothing left of it. Now that's at 50-mile diameter. If you attenuate it, if you make it bigger, if you make it about 100 miles in diameter, and that's enough to cover any city, you know, then it isn't quite as powerful. But what happens is, if there's an incoming missile or an incoming bomber or whatever, it hits the shield, and as soon as it hits the shield, an EM pulse duds everything in the missile or in the bomber, so it's totally useless. The nuclear material in it is rendered useless, and it just drops to the earth like a rock. So nothing can get through this. Now, this also can be transmitted across vast distances with no intervening travel. So if they have a scalar device, let's say in Moscow, and they see that for whatever reason we're deciding we're going to bomb Cuba, we're firing nuclear missiles at Cuba, they could just push a button and in a couple of seconds, boink, there's this shield over Cuba. Just to give you one example. Now, additionally, you can use these same globes, as I have mentioned, as a detonating device. So, and the exothermic blast from these things can be nearly nuclear in nature. It can use lesser levels of power to simply destroy all electronic devices. We've already mentioned that. That is called dudding. Now, there's endothermic mode. This is the opposite. And here you create what is called a cold explosion. Now, that sounds kind of like, what? You know, a cold explosion? But that's, remember, that was what was felt right after the earthquake in Yugoslavia. The way this works is it just draws all the heat energy out of the atmosphere in just a matter of a few seconds. And I don't know if any of you have seen that movie last year. It was called The Day After Tomorrow. And it was like, you know, kind of about this weather apocalypse. And they had this one scene where this, like, storm came in over New York, almost like a freezing hurricane. And wherever the eye of this hurricane came, it was like the temperature would drop like 150 degrees in a matter of 2 or 3 minutes. And everything just froze solid, you know. And it was like you were flash frozen if you were out in that. And they can do that with this weapon, this endothermic mode. They could put this, and of course, if you drop the temperature that low, you're putting a lot of things into an area where they're getting near absolute zero. And that means metal gets brittle, tanks will shatter, buildings will shatter, steel girders will shatter. Then they did actually test this thing on April 9th, 1984, off the Kuril Islands, off the Sea of Japan. And what happened is an airplane, a Japanese airliner, was flying over this particular area, and they saw all of a sudden this enormous thunderhead develop to the level of 60,000 feet in 2 minutes. Because what it did is it pulled, when it's cold, it like sucks moisture out of the atmosphere. You know, it gets real cold and it's dry. What happened was it just sucked vast amounts of water out of the ocean and created this 60,000 foot high thunderhead that was 200 miles in diameter in less than 2 minutes. This thing was so big that essentially the people in the airliner thought it was a nuclear explosion. It happened so fast, except there was no light flash. So again, that's something that's quite scary. Now, the mind snapper mode is even worse, in my mind, because, you know, we can kind of understand, okay, you blow things up, you have a shield, you make things cold, but this is where you're actually messing with the human mind, with your mind, perhaps. At a low level, this weapon can cause people to lose consciousness. Raising the level put people into a trance, and they become hypnotized, and they'll do anything you tell them to do. At the high level, all living things in a target area would instantly fall down dead. And I mean everything. The Russians used this in Afghanistan, this weapon, against the Mujahideen, back when they were fighting them in the 80s. And there's this one